Très bien, je vous propose de commencer. Bienvenue pour cet entretien avec Clara Dupont-Monod. Merci d'être ici pour son dernier livre, S'adapter, qui est paru chez Stock à l'automne passé et qui a déjà obtenu, comme vous le savez, des prix prestigieux, le prix Femina, le prix Goncourt des lycéens. Et donc, j'imagine que vous en avez entendu parler, sinon vous l'avez déjà lu même. Et donc, c'est un peu difficile pour moi d'arriver, après autant d'interviews que vous avez déjà eues, et surtout de m'entretenir avec quelqu'un qui a l'habitude aussi de faire des entretiens.
Also here interviewing someone who's very much used to interviewing other people. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the way I analyze your book, and I hope that we'll be able to open up this interview in new directions for you. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the book. You may know that the book is articulated around a disabled child, an inadapted child, which is the terminology used by Clara Dupont-Monod. This child establishes different relationships with three main characters in the family. First of all, the firstborn, the younger sister, and the youngest, who has not known the disabled child directly, but who is going to establish a rapport with this brother who has passed away because of the influence he has had on the family. So there are three different narrations, that of the firstborn, the younger sister, and the youngest child. And you've really meticulously interwoven these stories. There are phrases that are repeated in your book that help us navigate through the book. It goes to show that these are individuals, but there are relationships being interwoven between the three. These three parallel stories help you bring out different emotional undertones through each one of the stories. Each relationship is characterized by different emotions. For the firstborn, there is a lot of devotion, a huge amount of love that overwhelms him. He is fighting with these emotions as he can. Then there's the younger sister, who is a lot more angry against this situation that is imposed onto the family. And then there's the youngest brother, who discovers what the family was made of before he was born through the silences. I was very much struck by these different tonalities in the book, and I was very much moved, I have to admit, by a certain number of scenes, including one where the firstborn, who was very close to his disabled brother for years, once the disabled child is institutionalized in a specialized establishment, the firstborn only sees his brother once a year during the holidays, and that's an emotional shock for him. And you describe very minutely the strategies that are developed by this child to overcome these difficulties he has to reestablish a relationship that was so important for him at an age that is particularly critical. So before we hear you on these issues and on other issues, if you agree, I would like to read a passage of your book. We're here for literature, and I would like you to hear what Clara Dupont-Monod has to say through her book. Page 56-57, it's when the firstborn, who was the closest to the disabled child in the family, who's taken care of him, who has really helped him, and after several months of separation, the firstborn sees his disabled brother back at home, and he has a hard time reconnecting to him. So 2 pages that I will read. Unfortunately, there is no translation into English, so you will be hearing the original French.
Donc je cite. Ses pas, donc c'est l'aîné, ses pas le portèrent vers la chambre fraîche. Il poussa la porte, marcha vers le lit à volutes blanches. L'enfant, comme à son habitude, était allongé sur le dos. Il avait grandi. Il portait un pyjama violet de taille 10 ans et des chaussons fourrés de laine de mouton. Ses poings étaient fermés, sa bouche entr'ouverte, absolument semblable à lui-même. Ses yeux noirs erraient, à moins qu'ils ne suivent des trajectoires précises. Il écoutait la rivière et les cigales par la fenêtre ouverte. L'aîné s'agrippa aux volutes comme à une rambarde, se pencha vers le matelas. Parce que l'enfant avait la tête tournée vers la fenêtre, il offrait sa joue ronde et soyeuse. L'aîné s'y posa en oiseau qui rentre au nid, avec un tel soulagement qu'il en eut les larmes aux yeux. Remontèrent tous les mots enfouis depuis des mois. Il lui parla comme avant, sans effort, la joue contre la sienne, avec les intonations qu'il connaissait. Il lui raconta sa ruse misérable, ôtait ses lunettes pour ne plus le voir tout en essayant, lui raconta les flux des jours sans lui. Son cœur s'ouvrait comme un fruit mûr. Pourtant l'enfant ne sourit pas, ne cligna même pas des yeux. Il regardait ailleurs et respirait doucement, comme toujours. Il ne reconnaissait plus sa voix. Depuis combien de temps l'aîné ne lui avait-il pas parlé? Il se redressa, très pâle, saisit son sac et partit rejoindre ses amis. Après, il y a une autre scène que je vais pas lire maintenant.
There's another scene that follows where they are brought back together. But maybe to start off this interview, I know it's always a little weird to hear someone else read one's own words. I'd like to ask you about the family, about the scale of the family. Is this a relevant scale to explore this? There are relationships that are not just between parents and their children, but between siblings. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that you spoke about this book very well. I think he needs encouragements. There have been many presentations of the book before, and yours is much better than others. So first of all, I'd like to thank you. Your question is actually very relevant because the starting point was the siblings more than the disability of a child or the family, more generally speaking. As a novelist, I was interested in the siblings. I'd noticed something that always moves me, always strikes me. When you speak to siblings, you often come to realize that a single event was experienced by very different ways depending on the position they have. The firstborn is going to experience the event in a very different way from his younger siblings and from their youngest siblings. And when they speak, they say, well, no, that wasn't the way it was. And so you realize that depending on your position, as a sibling, you experience things completely differently. So that was the starting point. And then I realized that in literature, this topic has not been very much explored. There are many novels about parents and their children, about children and their parents, and they're usually wonderful novels. But siblings are a topic that is very little explored. And then one last element that really compelled me to write about siblings is that, to me, it's a living organism in which each individual element is able to be extremely mobile. As life takes its course, a younger brother or sister is going to behave like a firstborn or like parents, so it's always in motion, it's always moving, it's very plastic, but there's also a certain amount of rigidity. You're the firstborn and you remain the firstborn for your entire life. So it's both very moving and very immobile. For a novelist, it's great from this point of view because there are a lot of things that we can explore. And I would like to add something. We're programmed to leave our parents. Our children are programmed to leave us. They're doing so. That's at least our hope. And at the same time, it's something that is very hard to experience. But your siblings never leave you. They live alongside you all their lives. So there isn't this break between you. To give you an example, I was in Mulhouse recently, and I was very much struck. I went to a bookshop. A man came to see me to have his book signed, and he told me something that was absolutely beautiful. He told me, I haven't spoken to my sister in the past 12 years. I saw that you were here, that the book is about 3 siblings. I came to see you, and my sister phoned me as I was driving to see you. That's wonderful, isn't it? Well, yes, and you explore the way how between the 2 brothers, or between siblings, relationships change, they fluctuate, they evolve. The firstborn is being taken care of by his younger sister, when in actual fact she had a hard time because she felt he was too much devoted to the younger brother. Yes, absolutely. Siblings constantly adapt. They have to. And as a novelist, that's what I find fascinating. Roles change, things change, but at the same time, in the book, and I hope this is something that is very visible, the firstborn remains the firstborn all his life. He's the one who's there to learn. He's there to check that the bike's brakes are functioning. He makes sure the swings is working properly. So he's very careful. He takes care of everything. Now, let's look at the title, S'adapter. I tried to see occurrences of this word to see whether, independently from the story you recount, there isn't something that is close to ethics teachings about the relationships between the various characters. You can adapt in different ways. Each storyline shows that you can adapt in different ways. The firstborn adapts by trying to protect himself from this love that's too overwhelming. Yes, but he's already entirely devoted to this formidable love. What I like in literature is that you can segment things. I maybe cut you off and interrupted you slightly, but what I'm interested in with the firstborn, what I liked to write and to discover is the fact that his love for his brother is almost medieval. It's an unconditional kind of love, a little bit like Tristan and Iseult. What I liked with the firstborn is that he's very much affected by his disabled brother, who is entirely devoid of malevolence. This brother isn't cruel at all. He was born with a tiny little part of his brain working. Hardly nothing works except for his hearing. He can hear. The firstborn understands this at one point and therefore translates the world he sees around him, describes what happens around him. He translates the world around him in sounds, and that's what he does out of love. And the child, hearing this, has a few emotions he can express. He can smile, he can cry. That's his way of expressing himself. But the firstborn, what the firstborn likes about his brother is this notion of purity. His younger brother cannot judge. He cannot condemn. He's unable to do so. And he sees this as a wonderful world of possibilities that touches him very much. The younger sister mother is very angry. She balls her fists. She's infuriated by the birth of this younger brother who's disrupted the life of her family. She thinks her younger brother confiscates her older brother. She doesn't dare invite friends at home on Wednesday afternoons because she's ashamed of her brother. She's ashamed of being ashamed of her brother, which is very singular as an emotion. And she thinks that the birth of her brother is unfair. She thinks it's brutal, and she's right about that. It is brutal. So at first, she rejects her brother. Her anger is a vertical strength, whereas her older brother is more horizontal, or her younger brother is horizontal. He's lying down all the time. He's on the continuum between a newborn and an elderly man. He's ageless. He has no abilities, and yet he wreaks havoc in my life. So how can this individual deprived of everything can reach such havoc in my life? That's the way she sees things. What she does not immediately understand is that she is going to have to live with it, and that's exactly what to adapt means. At first, she does things against it, and then all of a sudden, she manages to convert her rage in something more constructive, and she's, in the end, the one who makes the family continue working. And then there's the youngest brother who comes after all the tragedy. He's got a given position amongst the siblings. He is going to have to adapt. He's going to take his place. There's something rewarding to be the youngest brother. He's there to heal. He starts walking, and everyone celebrates this because his brother could not walk. He can invite his friends at home. On the other hand, he's in charge of his parents' healing, so it's a heavy burden for him. And speaking to his deceased brother, he says, well, if you hadn't passed away, would I be there? It's great for psychoanalysts. And he feels very guilty. He apologizes for living and being normal. He's valiant. He adapts. He takes his place in the family, amongst the family. He's very much attached to his family, and he's very much devoted to his family. The book is not very modern, which is maybe not its greatest selling point, but it's not against families, it's in favor of families. Families have been described as a place for neurosis, for crises. Let's not forget that that's where there's the greatest amount of support. The three siblings care for each other in their own way. The disabled child look after the siblings in his way, parents too. And then there are the stones. I'm pretty sure we'll talk about it later, but it's a state of vigilance, and that's what families are there for too. You said that adapting is to do for and not to work against, but if we look at the book, you say this, it's not in the mouth of the firstborn, the younger brother, or the younger sister, or the youngest. It's the women in the mountains. They adapt, so there's this teaching. Doing in favor and not working against, it's the women in the mountains. That's something that I really liked. We're here in the foothills of the Jura Mountains. You know the mountains very well, I'm sure. This is not necessarily something that's specific to the Cévennes Mountains, but what you've just said, the fact that you've got to work for and not work against, that's something that you can observe with populations that are a bit harsh. I think we could say the same thing with the Jura Mountains or the Alps. At one point or another, there's this notion that you have to adapt to the nature around you. Nature requires you to be humble, and it's not nature that has to adapt to humankind. It's the other way around. If you look at the skies, they're overcast, you decide to go hiking or take your boat out, you'll lose against nature. So nature is personified, and I think it's very common to these populations. It is nature that imposes its laws on us and not the contrary. I come from a family that comes from the Cévennes Mountains. We're Protestants. It seems to me that Switzerland is a country that is very much in favor of Protestants than some areas in France. I haven't had to invent much in this book because that's what my family is like. Protestants, when they're Calvinists, well, they're not necessarily clowns. They're not clownish. Verbalizing expressions is not their forte, and that's been the case for centuries now. We translate emotions in different ways, often through silences or gestures. And these women, I know, they're the women from my family. It's very Protestant in nature. He comes from the mountains. He's very loyal. I really wanted to pay tribute to this. In the Cévennes, we call trails dry because they're so narrow. Two people can't walk next to each other. You've got to walk in front of each other. And I think at one point, the youngest brother says, people here look like they're trails. There's a lot of solitude, and on the other hand, there's a lot of sharing because you have to share. I have to admit that I felt this Protestantism, not in a negative way. I felt it in the loyalty, the fact that we remain siblings whatever happens, despite the fact that roles may evolve. Members of the family have to have this culture of loyalty, of course. That's why I spoke of ethics, of moral teachings. I was very sensitive to this throughout the book. Now I'd like to come back to the disabled child who is ill-adapted. There are characters in the history of literature, not only French literature, but literature from different countries, who embody purity and who reveal everything that surrounds them. There's Dostoevsky's character of the idiot, who embodies a kind of purity, who challenges the rest of the world, the rest of society. And I felt the same kind of narrative experiment here. I'm going to put a family in this kind of context, in this kind of a situation. That's exactly how I read your text. I read your text as a coming-of-age novel. There are actually 3 coming-of-age novels in parallel in your book. And there again, I think there's a lesson there. You can learn many things from someone like this who's disabled. This is something that I read elsewhere, I think. But what was your sentence? Again, it was a beautiful sentence. This is something that I'll write down. You've got a lot to give when you've got nothing to convey. I'll end up interviewing you, says Clara. Now, if I take other references, Fernand de Ligny, who worked with autistic people in the 70s and 80s, he said wonderful things. He said, autistic children, you should try to go towards these children rather than bring them back towards normalcy. These children can spend 5 hours in front of a fountain. They're fascinated by the fountain, and they don't see anything around them. As a philosopher and practitioner, he wonders how he can become water for these children. So I read you with this in mind. I read you with the idea that there's something so pure that there's a being who is so pure that it calls for something entirely new for humankind. You speak about, you describe the river, the forest, the mountains. They've got nothing to convey, and yet you can learn a lot from them. There's this attitude, this learning attitude that calls for adaptation, and I think that's the condition to being normal. Yes, and I think you're talking about the relationship our societies have with people who are different. I think the question that these siblings beg is that if you have to adapt to the ill-adapted, who's the most ill-adapted? It questions norms, and we're in societies that are very egocentric, and we tend to forget this. This is not a secret, but the novel had as a starting point my family. My family had a disabled child, and who passed away when he was 10 years old. My relationship to this child is far from being negative. It's something that had a huge influence on me. I loved this child. It made me a lot smarter, a lot more intelligent. When you speak to people who live with disabled children, they tell you, I have to adapt to him. It's not the same way of relating to time, to senses, and it should be necessary for everyone to be able to do so. We live in societies, I don't know how things are in Switzerland, but in France, it's a national disaster for families to have disabled children. When the firstborn sees his parents have to deal with administrative red tape, having to submit documents and file after file to have the younger brother institutionalized, it's a scandal. In France, every 3 years, you have to put together 40 different documents to prove that your child is still disabled, as if Down syndrome was something you could heal from. Now, things evolve, and I do understand that you have to submit a file every 3 years. Disabilities hardly ever improve positively, so you ask these families every 3 years to submit a new file. It's horrendous. It's shameful. At one point, I was invited to a program on the radio station France Inter. Towards the end, I read an open letter to the French administration. I'm a classical dancer, and I gave this example. I said my hobby is classical dance, and French bureaucracy is there to destroy families. I have special dancing shoes. You've got acronyms that helps torture drag on. So I read out this open letter, and a lot of people started making phone calls. This open letter was published on Facebook, and people's reactions are horrendous. These are families who have to live through this administrative maze, and this amounts to administrative abuse, and it goes to show the relationship a society can have with something that's different from it.
As if we feel we're alive, and we have to punish those who we feel are less alive or less operational. And I think that of the two, society is more handicapped than the actual handicapped people. Yes, once again, the question of how we handle differences. But where do we situate difference? And I think that your environment, the Cévennes, the mountains, the fact that the stones are the narrators, means that the boundary between humans and non-humans, normal and abnormal, is not clear. It's blurred. There's a continuity of possibilities of relationships. That's thanks to the mountains. The mountains as a narrative element allowed me to convey ideas like that without putting them actually into words. The law of the mountains is that humans have to adapt to the mountains and not the opposite. And the brothers and sisters know about the law of the mountains, but now they have to apply the same law to their family, and that's not the same thing. Going with the flow instead of against it, they know that they have to do that with the mountains. But now it's a matter of the family and a member of their family, and that's much more difficult. And in the huge ocean of questions that they have to face, it allowed me to put forward, and this is something I firmly believe, that we are all children of a place. I think a place, we all have an identity in a place. I think that there's much more identity of place than blood identity. When we talk about children of our enfants du pays, being a child of your country, of course, there are people who fall in love with a place and decide to live there, and then there's a different kind of love story between the person and the place. And I don't think it's by chance that in French there's only one letter that's different between bond and place. So I'm pretty sure that a place can also be a relative or a parent. Okay, well then, let me ask this question about humanism. Now, that's a broad question. Yes, that's what I'm going to try to explain. You depict an extreme case of a human being who has little power, but I think that this gives you the ability to show the whole range of possibilities on the chain of normality, if we can call it like that, between the handicapped child, the river, animals, the mountains. There, you build bridges. This handicapped child and, for example, the bond between the older brother are also bonds that they have with animals and with the mountains. This gives us access to something much bigger. And that brings us to man's place in the universe, the fact that we're not the center of the universe. This opens the door to interactions with inanimate objects or unlikely relationships. You talk about the wind, for example, trees. And I think that behind all of this, yes, the Cévennes happened to be the geographical place, but the theme is about place, location. And we see through the child how one can interact with stones or rivers. So the younger sister, who's very angry, is furious when she sees that the mountains don't care about her distress. And she is furious that the elementary laws of the universe never apologize. But as she evolves, as she develops, she will understand this, and also that the laws of the universe never condemn or judge. If there's no pardon, no judgment, there's a parallel between this, the environment and the child. The handicapped child neither judges nor condemns, exactly like the mountains. So this is something we're no longer used to, the idea of just being there, just existing, a handicapped child, powerless, who actually has a huge amount of power. This is just like the mountains, and the logic and the laws are the same. So we go from the infinitesimal to the immense, from the powerful, the truly powerful, the mountains with their animals, with their rivers, with the trees, the storms, the stone, and the child, powerless child. But both of them, each in their own way, have the same power, the power of regenerating a family, allowing the family to move through this experience. In fact, the younger sister at the brother's funeral, she's never held her brother. She tried to once, and it was a disaster. When she hears the river running in the valley, she experiences this as permission to let go, and she starts to cry. But it took the sound of the running water to give her this implicit permission to surrender. So you're in competition with the Prix Goncourt des lycéens, because the students who gave me my award said to me, "This is a book of war." And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, if you look closely, you use a lot of expressions that we usually use in war. Surrender. The child is a form of surrender." And it's true. I do use a war-like vocabulary because adapting means warring, means fighting. And until you manage to sign a truce. So going with the flow looks easy, sounds easy, but it takes an entire lifetime to get there. They went through an accelerated course in this family. But what does going with the flow mean? It means crying when your brother dies because he was part of your family, taking care of the brother, describing the world to him as the older brother does. We see this every day, people taking their handicapped sister or brother to the cinema and explaining the film to them, holding the brother or sister by the hand, going through the panic attacks or the seizures. Well, if we take the mountains as something so immense and sublime that we have to be humbled in their presence. When I go to the mountains, which I do often, what calms me, what makes me feel serene is not the mountains in their immensity, in their watchfulness. In the Alps, you see the angles at which the mountains were created. We know that millions of years ago, these mountains were created, and that is what gives me a sense of calm. You often draw a parallel between the family in the mountains and the mountains. You often emphasize the temporality of families, the intergenerational bonds, the grandmother, the generations that pass on knowledge and traditions. But you don't talk so much about geological time. Is this something that has meaning for you or not? Yes, great meaning. I agree with you that all of this was there long before my lifetime and will live long after I do, and that makes me feel really calm. It's very humbling, and I think that's a good thing. It's good for us. The mountains are telling us that the mountains don't need you. Nature doesn't need you. They've been doing without you forever. So perhaps this function is fulfilled by the stones in the book. We haven't talked about this much, but the story is narrated by the stones in the courtyard of the house and the hamlet that the house is set in. And the stones tell us that they are witnesses, and they've been witnessing for thousands of years, families coming and going in this courtyard. And there'll be other families after this one. So it's the voice of wisdom. It's the voice of the elders. And if we want to avoid pathos as a writer, it's a challenge. You have to find the right level of distance from your subject, and I think that's what I did with these stones. And then there's an idea of the length of time outside the human race. And the youngest brother is a fan of history, and he studies history, and he says he's thinking about the idea that he's only one link in the chain. And as he says, he loves history because his history is incomplete. He studies the Middle Ages and the Second World War, and it fills the holes in his history, in his personal story, because he's only part of his family to a certain extent. Sorry for the spoiler, but the handicapped child dies. There you go. It's spoiled. I hope nobody will be surprised. I hope you didn't think he went on a hike in the Cévennes. No, he actually dies. And the youngest brother is chopping wood with his father, and he's stacking the wood. And there are labels with the years where the wood was stacked, and he looks at the past years, and he says, all these years before I was born. And he thinks about the emotions, the experiences of his brothers, sisters, his parents, that all happened without him. So he doesn't have an easy role, but I'm very proud of all three of them because they all adapt. They all succeed, I think, in adapting to the situation. I'm very proud of them. And but the youngest brother is always trying to get details from his sister. When his sister says, when I was little, he says, well, I would give anything to have been there when she was little. And he tries to fill in the gaps, and that's why he likes history. So what was the story? It wasn't the question. It wasn't about history. No, let's go back to the stones. You give the stones a voice. And that also resolves the problem of focus, because the omniscience is geological. But the stones talk, and they talk about themselves. The stones in the courtyard or in the walls of around the house. So these are not rough stones. They've been hewn by human beings. Can you tell us about this choice? Why did you have these stones talk rather than the stones in the mountains? Well, maybe you have this in Switzerland. I don't know, but in the Cevennes we have dry stone walls. You have dry stone walls here, yeah. Well, probably in all the mountains in the world you have this. So the walls are built without mortar. They're slotted together. It's a very difficult undertaking. The wall holds up because all the stones support each other, and that was the image I wanted to give of the siblings and on a broader scale of family. And even when there's a big storm, the wall might fall down, but it'll be rebuilt. A new balance, a new dynamic, a new wall. So for me, that is the siblings. And of course, as you know, I love the Middle Ages. And in this book, I really like the idea of having talking stones. In the Middle Ages, inanimate objects are often given a voice, made animate. For example, bells have a name, which is very logical. There were clocks didn't exist yet, and so it was this bells that told you what time it was, whether it was time to go to work, stop working, etc. So the most familiar sound for the medieval, in the Middle Ages was bells, and they were called Maria, Bernadette, because they were friends. They were friendly objects. And going one step further, inanimate objects were thought to have a soul. For example, the sword was the extension of the knight's hand, and when you'd won a battle, you would thank your sword. Charlemagne's sword was called Joyous, and you can see it in the Louvre. Marie, Bedrock, these are other names of swords. It's a form of medieval paganism, which I'm very fond of. And one last thing I'd like to say is, how often have you walked past a ruin and thought, oh, I wish the stones could talk, if only stones could talk, could speak. Recently, I was talking to a friend about this, a friend who's in the cinema, and I thought, yes, I can do that. I can make the stones talk. I'm fully in favor of taking liberties as an author. If I want to talk about Mozart and Mussolini in the same book, why not? People might say that's not normal, it doesn't exist, but that's one of the things that you can do as a writer. You'll be signing your book upstairs in a bit. The bookshop has set up a table there. But for the time being, we have a few moments for questions, if any of you would like to take the microphone. Yes, the first question is always the most difficult. Who's going to take the bold step of requesting the microphone? You talked about a feeling which is difficult to admit, shame and being ashamed of being ashamed. I wonder if this is not specifically Protestant. No, I don't think so. I think it's specific to the families of handicapped children. When I sign books, dedicate books, I see this over and over. It's very common in these families, and I'm desperate when I see that they're ashamed of being ashamed, but I know what it feels like. I don't want to tell you too much about the book, but the scene in the park with the oldest brother and a woman. Okay, well, maybe there's also the dolphin scene. Ha 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 ha. No, but there really is a scene where the older brother takes his handicapped brother to the park, and a mother comes up to him and makes a very rude comment, but she didn't mean to be rude, and those are the worst. She was trying to be kind, but it was worse than if she had been trying to be rude. And in fact, this is something that all families of handicapped children experience. There's always a moment when ignorant people are very hurtful. It's not very often that people are willfully cruel to handicapped people. It happens, but the more common phenomenon is that people pull back. I think the problem is we're not educated, starting in schools, in how to approach handicapped disability. There have been experiments putting disabled children in classes with non-disabled children. There's absolutely no problem. Wheelchair, blind child, all the other children adapt very easily and turn into adults who, if one day they're going to hire people, will be more comfortable with disabled people. And in a couple of generations, you can change the way society sees people. In Switzerland, do you have that? Oh, fantastic. The Swiss are really great. Yeah, it's called inclusive schools. Oh, we have that too. But I can tell you it doesn't really mean anything. No, it works. I can see that my children make no distinction between handicapped and non-handicapped children. But institutionally speaking, it's difficult. It's complicated because we don't have enough trained staff, and the teachers find it difficult to cope. But the children have absolutely no problem with it. Absolutely. And this creates a very open mindset. When differences become familiar to you, then they become normal, and they're no longer differences, if you see what I mean. So the feeling of being ashamed, to be ashamed, is something that all the families of disabled people will tell you. And I think it's due to the pejorative remarks and gazes that you get from other people. We have time for one last question. Only questions? Only two questions?
Peut-être une troisième.
Maybe even a third. Yes, madam. I wanted to ask you, when you say the three succeed, can you tell us what they succeed in adapting, in going with the flow and not against the flow? I thought you meant succeeding in creating a family as we see. Yes, that is also part of going with the flow. Thank you for your question. That's very true. The Goncourt des lycéens asked some very interesting questions. You may know that there's a sort of electoral campaign for this award. You meet students, high school students, and they ask you questions, and you have to try to give a compelling narrative, because there's only one winner. And one of the questions that I absolutely stalled on was, Madame Dupont-Monod, how can you explain that there's only one letter that's different between adopt and adapt? And I said, oh, wait a minute, let me think about that. I didn't really have a good answer, but what you've said is totally true. And I think this is connected. Accepting differences requires the tightening of bonds between the children. Do you see what I mean? It's when you become a true group that you can incorporate difference. Do you see what I mean? No, I really believe it. It's you can bring out your sentence again that you said earlier. No, well, I have a question then. Why would this only work in a family? No, that's what Madam is saying. No, you can transpose this to society, moving from singular to universal. And I don't think we can reach a universal level without individuals. When I handed my manuscript in, I was a little worried about what my publisher would say, because there were a lot of unusual elements, the Cévennes. the situation. A disabled child, it's not exactly a love story, a conventional love story. There were strange viewpoints. We've got the 3 children and also the stones in the courtyard. So it was a layered novel, and I wondered how to get all these individualities to speak to people who haven't, so that they could relate if they haven't had the same experience. That's why I made the story into a sort of tale. You may have noticed the children don't have names. You may have noticed also that you can't tell immediately that you're in the Cévennes. It's like a fairy tale. We don't know where the castle is located. Even the first sentence is similar to Once Upon a Time. So I think the reference to the fairy tale was a counterweight to the narrative that was layered so that we could bring in the universal aspect. But I do hope, it did appeal to a lot of people who had no experience with disability. A lot of people said to me, no, I had no idea what it was like, but I was very moved because I think that we can adapt in any family. You can adapt to your environment. You have to adapt to the fact that reality is not the way you would like it to be. I think everybody has encountered that. So that's the universal dimension, but you have to go through the individual to get to the universal. One last question, madam, down here. Sir, I really liked what you said about the dry stone walls. We have many in my country. How did you achieve harmony among the 4 voices? Well, I fumbled around for a bit. One of the first versions of the book, S'adapter, was almost entirely seen from the viewpoint of the stones. It wasn't divided into the 1 chapter per child. And I decided they were taking up too much room, and it didn't work. Then I had the 3 chapters, 1 for each child, but in the first person, and that was catastrophic. It was impossible to get any kind of perspective. So I took another stab at it, and it was a question of distance. I think literature is more about the voice than the type of writing. That maybe comes from my medieval studies, the oral tradition. But I deeply believe that literature is made to be read aloud. I think the medievals were correct, and that's why Flaubert used to read his paragraphs out as loud as he could. Okay, he was a bit mad, but reading things aloud changes everything. And I've been interviewed on the radio. I've had a radio show, and it changes everything. So I'm very attached to reading, speaking, and I thought that having the stones, but leaving room for the 3 children, the 3 sisters and brothers, would give us something that was close to the Knights of the Grail. There's a narrator. There's always a narrator who steps in from time to time and says, "Oh yes, but don't think that this," and then we start off onto another tale. So that's a medieval artifice, and I know we're in 2022, and I'm talking to you about the 11th century, but it's a method that works. Thank you very much, Clara. A short question then. I'll try to keep it short. You talked about the language of war and the stones, and it seemed to me that there was another expression that we could use. There is another expression we can use. I was born during the war. And don't forget that we used to say the walls have ears. I'd like to thank you very much because this book really resonated with me. And you won the Goncourt des lycéens because your book really spoke to young people, and that is extraordinary. Which means that you have an audience that will be future leaders. That's excellent. Thank you very much. I think that's a good way to close the session. Thank you.
Et je vous rappelle donc que
so, once again, you can meet Clara Dupont-Monod upstairs. The Bastion bookstore has the book ready to be signed if you'd like to purchase a copy.